All right, so this is the 11th video in our series of videos going through the whole Bible, surveying it. You'll be glad to know this one will be a little shorter than the video on Joshua. Judges and Ruth. Now, Judges is the second of the books in what we call the Deuteronomistic history: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And they are part of the historical books. Now, Ruth is not actually part of the Deuteronomistic history. Ruth in the Hebrew Bible, in the Jewish Bible, Ruth is in the writings. So these little small writings, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Lamentations, Esther, Ruth, those are all in the writings in the Jewish Bible, the third part. The law, the prophets, and the writings are the third part. But in terms of the period into which the content of Ruth fits in the time of the Judges. And in the Christian Bible, Ruth is Joshua, Judges, Ruth is right there. So it makes sense for us to treat Ruth here rather than at the end. So the book of Judges. Now, the book of Judges is, I would say, again, you're welcome. I have not assigned you to read the books of Joshua and Judges in this whole Bible survey because it seems like it's a lot to read in a short period of time, although you are very welcome to do it. But I think I get the impression, so when you read the book of Joshua, you sure get the impression that all of the Canaanites have been destroyed, or at least most of the Canaanites have been supplanted, and that Israel has pretty much taken over the whole land. And I'm not in any way saying that's not true. I'm saying that that is an emphasis, that the emphasis of Joshua is the conquest was successful. The emphasis of Judges is not, it doesn't have the same feel. In fact, the book of Judges gives us more the feeling of Israel didn't have enough faith for the conquest to be completely successful. You get the sense that there's still an awful lot of indigenous people living there, that there are still plenty of Canaanites around when we get to the book of Joshua. It feels like, especially in chapter 1, when you read Judges. When you read Judges chapter 1, it sure feels like there's an awful lot that isn't under complete Israelite control. Now, the reason why Judges is a really good, Joshua is too, but Judges is a really good embodiment of what we call Deuteronomistic theology. And again, what is Deuteronomistic theology? It's the idea that if you obey God, you will prosper. If you don't obey God, you will lose your freedom. You'll be sold into slavery. And so Judges 1 really sets what we might call the 4 pillars of Judaism. Now, this is not something Jews say. Jews don't say, oh, here are the 4 pillars of Judaism. You've heard of the 5 pillars of Islam. Here are the 4 pillars of Judaism. It's not a thing. I get this idea of the 4 pillars of Judaism from one of my professors who came up with this. And it's a mnemonic to help us to remember this dynamic. It's not actually a thing, but it works. It's a grid, but just remember, it's a grid of our glasses. It's not something that Jews actually ever said. So the 4 pillars are these: monotheism, election, covenant, and land. So the idea is, 1, monotheism. There should be only one God for Israel. Now we've talked about whether it might have been more henotheism at this time, meaning, yes, Israel was only supposed to worship one God, monolatry, and Israel was only supposed to serve one God, henotheism. But they believed, or they would have called other spiritual powers gods. So they would have called Baal a god. They would have called Asherah a goddess, and so forth. And they may very well have been demonic powers. We talked about this in an earlier video in the series. But let's go ahead and use the word monotheism, even if it is a little anachronistic. Many would argue that the word monotheism is anachronistic at this point, but I'm going to ignore that, although I didn't, ironically. So number 1, monotheism, one God for Israel. Election, one people for God. Now, one of the neat things to me of the Old Testament is that this is not an absolute. So what does the book of Jonah basically say? One of the points of the book of Jonah is that God also cares for people who aren't Israelites, right? That if Ninevites, evil Ninevites, even if they will repent, God will show mercy upon them. But clearly in the Old Testament, God is doing something special with the people of Israel that he's not doing with the Hittites, for example. And so part of the dynamics of Joshua and Judges is there's one God for Israel, and Israel is God's special people whom he's called. You may know, what is it? First Chronicles 7:14, or is it Second Chronicles 7:14? If my people who are called by name, by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will heal their land, I will hear their voice, and so forth. Now that's about Israel, right? This is not about the United States, although I assume it could apply to any group of people who turn to the Lord. But in Chronicles, it's talking about Israel. So one God for Israel, monotheism, one special people called out for God. By the way, there's a great passage in Deuteronomy that says, God basically says, I didn't pick you because you were great, or because you were the greatest, or because, we were playing dodgeball and I got to pick the best person for my team. God doesn't treat it that way. God doesn't treat Israel as if I got first pick and I picked the best in the whole world. In fact, that's not what we get the impression from in Deuteronomy. The impression is I picked scrawny, little, weak, nerdy Israel to show how strong I was, to show that I could win even with these little podunk squeak, this pit squeak. What is it? Anyway, God says I picked them because they were the smallest, the runt, a hard luck group. Anyway, but God clearly, there's a sense of election in the Deuteronomistic history and theology. One God for Israel, monotheism, one people for God, election. Covenant is the arrangement, the divine arrangement between God and Israel. It's a kind of, if you will serve me, I will bless you, and so forth. It's a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of arrangement. That cheapens it. But covenant is a solemn arrangement between two parties. In Abraham's day, they ratify. The expression in Hebrew is to cut a covenant, and in Abraham's day, he actually cuts animals in half when he's making a covenant with El Shaddai. Anyway, so the covenant is the arrangement between the two. Monotheism, one God for Israel. Election, one people for God. Covenant, the terms of the arrangement, and then land is the focus of the blessing. And this is where we get especially to Judges, because if Israel will serve Yahweh, Israel will have the land. Now, of course, the story of Judges is a story of perpetual craziness. And stupidity, perpetual stupidity. So it's a cycle of stupidity. Israel's serving God and everything's great, and then they go after other gods, and then God lets some country, some foreign people take over them. And then they call out to the Lord and they say, Lord, we were stupid. Please forgive us. We'll serve you. They repent. And then God sends a judge, a deliverer like Samson, and they're freed from the enemy. And then they serve God and everything's going great. And then they start serving other gods. And then God sells them into slavery. And then they say, Lord, please, we're stupid. Save us. Then God raises a judge. And then everything's great. And then they start serving other gods. I mean, there's this cycle of stupidity. We were so stupid. And so it's this kind of constant cycle of stupidity in the book of Judges. There are 12 judges, 12 judges in 12 judges that are mentioned in the book of Judges: Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah. Ehud is interesting. This tells you I'm a bad person, but this is this guy who he's left-handed, which by the way, the ancient world, they didn't trust left-handed people. We've come a long way with understanding that left-handed people aren't bad people. But this guy Ehud, because he's left-handed, he hides his sword on a leg. They search the wrong leg, or at least they're looking at the wrong leg. And he says, I have a secret to tell you to the king. And the king has everybody out of the chamber. And then he says, here's the secret. I've come to kill you for Yahweh. And the left-handed man pulls his sword out and stabs Ehud, apparently stabs the king. And the king is apparently so large that the dagger he can't get it out. It's covered. And anyway, he escapes through the latrine, which has got to be fun. I've never done that, thankfully. But the people are afraid to go in because when you die, you lose your bowel control, and so they smell. There's a smell, and they're embarrassed to go in and check on the king because they think he's using the pot. Anyway, it's a very interesting story. I think Judges is clearly rated R. This is a rated R book for sure. Then you've got Deborah, who is Deborah's important, I think, in part because she is the #1 political figure in Israel. She is both the #1 political figure and the #1 spiritual figure. She is a prophetess. And so it's clear that in the Old Testament, it was okay for a woman to be general superintendent of the church. Wesleyan Church had a general superintendent a few years ago, Joanne Lyon. And, obviously there are people who grumble, woman in charge, grumble. And they, it never came to a head, and she's just super. But there were people who grumble. There shouldn't be a woman leading. And maybe they wouldn't put it that way. Maybe they'd grumble. She's a liberal, something like that. But, you could tell that usually there was that kind of bias deep down. Well, guess what? In the Old Testament, there was a woman who was #1, both politically and spiritually, over Israel. So it must be okay for God. I don't see it. There's no New Testament change here where the New Testament says, and now there will never, ever be a woman in charge again, or there will never, ever be. In fact, it goes the other direction in Acts 2. One of the things that indicates it's the age of the Spirit on the day of Pentecost is the fulfillment of scripture from Joel that says your sons and your daughters will prophesy. So if anything, the day of Pentecost opens up the floodgates for women to serve in this kind of prophetic and leadership role. More on that when we get to the New Testament. Gideon, you all know the story of Gideon's fleece. You may not, actually. I shouldn't assume you know the story of Gideon's fleece. God wants to use Gideon, and Gideon doesn't want to, apparently. And he basically sets some tests for the Lord. He says, okay, I'm going to put some wool outside. If in the morning the wool is wet but the ground is dry, then I'll lead Israel. It happened. And then he does the opposite. I forget the order, but now, okay, if the fleece is dry and the ground is wet, then I'll go to, and God does it. Anyway, I'm not sure that this is the best way to determine God's will. Remember, one of my themes is God meets us where we're at. And so that's the way that Gideon thought you find God's will. And so that's God's like, okay, fine, I'll do this. And God met him there. Now, when you read the rest of the Gideon story, my claim that they didn't know as much as we know. I mean, there's some really strange stuff in the Gideon story. He actually has, I think, a priest with something that sounds a lot like an idol operating out of his house, something like that. And it's kind of like, didn't you read Deuteronomy? It's not at all clear to me that they had read Deuteronomy at this time. And I've said this in these videos before. We go through this long period of time where Israel doesn't seem to be aware of what all the terms of the covenant are. They just don't understand. They don't know it all. It's a very puzzling kind of thing. Well, Jephthah. Let me mention Jephthah. Jephthah is an example. I think I mentioned him when I was talking about the third of the 10 commandments, by my reckoning. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord in vain. Jephthah takes a vow. He says, I'll sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house if I win this battle. And it's his daughter. And he sacrifices her, I think. That again, crazy. I mean, these people don't understand God the way that we understand God. Of course, they didn't have the Old Testament. And I'm arguing they didn't really even have access. Even if they had access to the Pentateuch, they were illiterate. They couldn't have read it. And so these judges, one, they don't come across as judges today. Well, I have a lifetime appointment and I went to law school. They're people that God raised for specific occasions to help restore Israel when they'd been under the thumb of their enemies. It's not like I'm going to go to the courthouse and talk to Jephthah. It's just not like that. And they have rough edges. This is part of what I mean when I say that the book of Judges has a very primitive feel to it. It doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like they really know their Bible. It doesn't feel like they know the Torah. And of course, Samson is the worst of all of them, I think. Or, well, maybe he's not the worst of all of them, but he's certainly not the best of all of them. killing people and setting fox tails on fire and setting them ablaze and things like that. I mean, Samson, like Jephthah, like Gideon, they're a hot mess. And so Samson ends up killing himself when he's a Nazirite, and he tells Delilah, she cuts his hair. It all comes crashing down. The Book of Judges is really should be made into a rated R movie, or actually probably not, but it's something. And of course, the book ends with Levite tales. Levite tales, Levite tales. I mean, the book of Judges gets worse and worse and worse, it seems, as we go. The tale of the Levite, and now the tale of the Levite, Canterbury Tales with Ken Shank. The book ends with this Levite who's a priest, right? And his concubine runs away. By the way, he's not particularly women friendly. It sounds like this is not a guy you want to be. So this is a reminder that not all ministers are righteous. And this was true in ancient Israel. This was a thought. Again, I'll let you decide what you think. You weren't right with God just because you were an Israelite. Even if God didn't fry you. When Jesus says, narrow is the way and few there be that find it, I used to think, well, that's not true in America because most Americans are Christians. Well, maybe I've become a pessimist in recent years. Feel free to rebuke me. But I wonder if Jesus may have been right, that even in the church, there may be a lot of people who aren't really in the church. Right now it's kind of popular to be a Christian in some circles. And we have these large mega churches with lots of happy people with a good 401k. And, are they all Christians? That's God's decision. That is not my decision. But just because you're a minister doesn't mean you're righteous. And unfortunately, we have so many examples of that. And that was true, I think, in ancient Israel. Just because you were a Levite did not at all mean that you were a good person. He was not, his concubine runs away. Given the way the story plays out, I suspect she had reason to run away. She runs away to Bethlehem. He goes and gets her. He's on his way back home, and he's passing through Benjamite territory. But like I said, the book of Judges makes it clear that there's still Canaanites there. This is a mixed land. This is not purely Israel. This is Israel plus. And he has to make a decision. Do I go to a town of my own people, the Benjamites, a Benjamite sandwich, or do I go to these secular Canaanites? Do I go to those evil atheists? No, they're not atheists. Do I go to the Canaanites who aren't my people? And he decides, I'm going to go with my people. And he goes and he stays in a Benjamite village. Well, they want to rape him. This is actually very similar to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah, in my opinion, is not really about homosexuality. It's about rape. It's about violence. And same thing here. They want to rape the Levite. And it's not because they like men. This is more along the lines of what we hear has happened in, I don't know how stereotypical this is, but I mean, you hear about in prison, men raping men and things like that. This is more of that kind of a situation than a matter of attraction. I think it's anachronistic to try to read either the Sodom and Gomorrah story or this story in terms of modern debates about homosexuality. I think that's just, we're reading our debates into something that would have been completely foreign to them. This is about domination. I think if we read it in historical context. And so when they say we want to show who's boss to this visitor you have, and the person who he stays with says, basically they end up sending the concubine out. And again, this is proof, by the way, that what they want is violence, because they go on to rape the concubine. It's a gang rape of the Levite's concubine. And in the morning, again, this statement more than anything else reveals his character to me. In the morning, he goes outside, his concubine's lying there, and turns out she's dead. Now, he wasn't waiting until they went away. He wasn't barricading the door thinking, I'll get to you as soon as I can. No, he apparently sleeps that night. Again, I don't know for sure, but he goes out in the morning, says, "Get up, it's time to go." I mean, there's no compassion to this guy at all. And he turns out she's dead. And then he's angry, not because a person is dead, but because he's lost his property. And he chops her up into 12 pieces and sends a piece to the 12 tribes of Israel and basically says, what faithless, I mean, basically, this is about the sacred duty of hospitality, which sounds trivial to us, because to us, hospitality, that's trivial. It was not trivial in the ancient world. This was a core value of ancient culture. There's a story in Ovid's Metamorphoses about a region that wasn't hospitable to Zeus and Hermes, and they killed and the gods killed everybody. I'll mention that story again maybe when we get to the book of Acts. But so the Levite isn't upset about the loss of a woman's life. He's not that enlightened. He's upset that he's lost property, and he's upset that his own people, I can't believe it, my own people, the Benjamites, would do something like this. And of course, Israel gathers a battle, and they kill almost all of the male tribe of Benjamin as a judgment upon them for this sort of injustice toward their fellow person. Anyway, it's craziness. Well, that's the book of Judges. Feel free to read it. It is rated R for sure. Okay, the book of Ruth. In that whole world, Ruth is, I mentioned Jonah earlier as an indication that God cares even for people from Nineveh. Well, the book of Ruth shows that God cares even for people from Moab. And she is a Moabitess. And because of a famine, I think it is, a couple of, a mother and two sons go to Moab, and they live there. And apparently there's more resources in Moab. And while they're there, the two sons get married to two Moabite women. And of course, the two men die. And so now the women, the daughters, the daughter-in-laws have a choice. And one of them, the mother basically says, Naomi, I think it is, says, you guys, there's no obligation to me. I'll go back to my people. You all find other husbands. And one of the daughter-in-laws does that, but Ruth wants to stay with Naomi. She goes back with Naomi to Israel. There's a great verse here. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Wherever you go, I will go. Something like that. Obviously, somebody made a song out of it, and it was sung at one of my sister's weddings. I can't remember which one. But anyway, Ruth goes back. Now, you may remember the law of levirate marriage. The law of levirate marriage is that if the oldest son does not have a male heir or does not have an heir, then, and he dies, then the younger brother will raise up seed for his older brother by taking on his wife as another wife, or at least to help her get pregnant so that she can raise up an heir to her dead brother. And this is similar to that, except it's not brothers, it's kinsmen. And so, by the way, this is a scandalous story. The word feet in Hebrew, it can mean feet, but it can also be a euphemism. So when the seraphim cover their feet with two of their wings, so they've got 6 wings in Isaiah 6. With 2 they fly, and with 2 of them they cover their feet. What are they covering? Well, many Hebrew scholars think that they're covering their genitals. Again, you don't have to agree with that at all. The Old Testament is a wild and wacky place. This is why I got my PhD in New Testament. The Old Testament is just far too scary and controversial. I thought, I'm going to stay in the New Testament. I know Jesus. Jesus Christ has died. Christ has risen. Christ will come again. I think I'm going to stay in the New Testament, and I'm going to let the bold people like Sarah Dirk be an Old Testament scholar. But anyway, some would argue that feet can be a euphemism for private parts, and so if, again, everything can be debated, but if that's the case, when Ruth, so Boaz he's had a little to drink and he's sleeping and she uncovers his feet and lays at his feet. It's like, what is she doing here? And when he wakes up, he's like, he's kind of shocked. What? There's a woman at my feet. What's going on here? This is a little scandalous potentially. Again, maybe it's just feet. I'm just the messenger. Don't kill the messenger. But Boaz is an honorable man. He does not touch her. He does not do anything with Ruth. There is another. She's been following, behind him, gathering up the scraps, which is also part of the law. And he basically says, "Okay, I'm very willing to take you on as a wife." He may have had other wives. We don't know. He's probably an older man, so he's probably already had a wife at least. But there's another man who's closer in relation to the deceased husband than he is. So he goes and checks with him. The guy says, "She's all yours." And so Boaz marries Ruth. And of course, Ruth is the great grandmother of King David. She has, what is it? There's Boaz, and then Obed, and then Jesse, and then David. And so Ruth is in the genealogy of Jesus. We mentioned in our previous video, we mentioned Rahab as being in the genealogy of David. She's a foreigner from Jericho, and she's ran a house of prostitution, and yet she can be redeemed. Ruth is a foreigner. She's a Moabitess, and yet she can become part of Israel. So all of the women in the genealogy of Jesus demonstrate, one, that God cares about women, and two, that God can redeem that which is not the ideal kind of thing. By the way, we didn't mention Tamar back in the book of Genesis. Tamar is married to Judah's son. Judah is the fourth child of Jacob in Genesis, and Judah, I just said her name. I just said her name. She keeps marrying Judah's sons in the law of levirate marriage, and they keep dying. And so Judah is very hesitant. Tamar. Judah is very hesitant to give her as married a daughter, as a husband. I'm sorry, as a wife to his youngest son, his only remaining son. And so, but he's supposed to. He's obligated to do it, right? He's obligated to raise up a seed for his oldest son who died. And so what she does is she dresses up like a prostitute, and she knows that Judah goes a certain way, and she apparently knows that Judah uses prostitutes. And so Judah, sure enough, she veils herself, so Judah doesn't know it's her. Judah uses her. She gets pregnant. Judah doesn't know that he's the father. And so Judah's outraged. How could you do this? How could you, notice the double standard here. This is the ancient world. It's a rough place. Women have it so much better than they've ever had it in the past. But when she had taken a token from him, and when she produces it, he realizes that, oh, okay, I'm the bad guy here. You've done what's right, and you've gotten pregnant, and I didn't die, so we're good. But you can see that there is a theme building here in the genealogy of Jesus. That Jesus doesn't require a pure religion. Kind of if you're a Harry Potter fan, pure bloods. Jesus doesn't require pure bloods. Jesus is fine with somebody who serves the Lord with their whole heart, and that can be a Rahab or a Tamar or a Ruth. And of course, Bathsheba is another one that we're going to come across soon enough. Well, this has been the book of Judges and the book of Ruth. Isn't the Old Testament a wild and crazy place? So we continue on in the next set of videos dealing with Samuel and Kings.